What would you do if the only thing left in your grandfather's estate was 180 acres of frozen rock and spruce, a 4-year property tax bill, and a handwritten note telling you to go see for yourself? The offices of Kaminsky and Associates were on the 2nd floor of a narrow brick building on Lakeshore Drive in North Bay, Ontario. The waiting room chairs had been reupholstered at some point in fabric that was practical and entirely charmless, and on a grey Thursday morning in late October, Cora Fielding, 37, sat in one of them and watched her brother examine his own thumbnail. Reed Fielding, 42, had driven up from Toronto in a leased Audi. He worked in commercial real estate and had booked the morning off for the occasion, which he'd mentioned twice in the parking lot. The estate lawyer, Louise Kaminsky, 59, spread the documents across the conference table with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been in this room, with this particular kind of family tension, more times than she cared to count. The liquid savings, $83,000 across 2 registered accounts. "Go to you, Reed," she said, along with the F-150, the workshopped equipment, and the contents of the storage locker in New Liskeard. Reed gave a single tight nod. He had, Cora suspected, done the arithmetic before he left Toronto. The mineral rights documentation held in the estate lockbox, the cabin structures and outbuildings, and the full land parcel, 182 acres in Timiskaming district, go to Cora. Silence. Then Reed exhaled slowly, the exhale of a man deciding how to frame something before he said it out loud. He left her the bush property. "He left me the land," Cora said. Cora. He turned to face her. He had the particular variety of patience in his voice that is really impatience presented more carefully. "The cabin roof came down in February. 3 years of property taxes in arrears. $11,000 before you do a single thing with it. 20 kilometers of track road that turns into a creek he spread his hands. There is nothing there. Granddad drove up there every summer for 40 years to sit in a lawn chair and look at spruce trees. That's all that property ever was." She said nothing. "There's also this," Louise said, sliding a sealed envelope across the table. Cora recognized the handwriting on the outside before she'd consciously processed it, her grandfather's careful, slightly backward slant. "He left it with me last March. He asked that I give it to you at the reading." Reed looked at the envelope, said nothing. Cora picked it up and put it in her jacket pocket without opening it. "One last item," Louise said. She produced a second letter on corporate letterhead, dated 10 days earlier. "A company called Northgate Resource Partners contacted the estate shortly after the death notice was filed. They're offering $45,000 for the land parcel, as is. No conditions on the structural damage or the outstanding taxes." Reed sat forward immediately, and something in his expression loosened, the way a room loosens when someone opens a window. "Take it, Cora. $45,000. Pay what you owe the municipality. Get yourself a proper place to live. Start over." He lowered his voice in the way people do when they want concern to carry more weight than it has earned. "You're already behind. This is a lifeline." Cora looked at the Northgate letterhead, a company name she'd never heard, moving on a piece of land that everyone agreed was worthless, using the word time-sensitive. "Who is the contact?" she asked. Louise checked the second page. A Mr. Declan Marsh. He described it as time-sensitive. Time-sensitive, on land that had sat untouched for decades. "Thank you, Louise. I'll be in touch." Cora stood, took her copy of the deed from the table. "Cora, be reasonable." "I'll call you." She didn't look at Reed again on the way out. She sat in the parking lot until her breath stopped fogging the windows, and then she opened her grandfather's letter. "Cora, if Louise has given you this, then I've gone. I expect Reed received the checkbook and you received the spruce trees, and I expect he had opinions about that arrangement. There is something on the property I never told a living soul. Not your grandmother, not your father, not Reed. I found it in the summer of 1971, and I sealed it away in the spring of 1974 for reasons that will be clear once you read what's inside. The entrance is set into the hillside behind the old prospecting shed, the concrete pad at the back. The shed's come down more than once over the years, but the seal holds. It's been holding 50 years. Do not sell to anyone who arrives quickly and offers more than the land appears to be worth on paper. A man who knows the value of what he wants doesn't volunteer that information. The rock doesn't lie, Cora. People do. The ground holds what's true. Your granddad, George. She drove north the following Friday. The access road was exactly as described. 2 frozen ruts through second-growth spruce, passable only because the ground was still hard. The cabin, when she reached it, stopped her at the doorway for a long moment. The north-facing section of the roof had surrendered to February's ice load and come down entirely, taking the back bedroom ceiling with it. The remaining 3 rooms were intact. Walls solid, floor dry, the cast-iron wood stove cold but whole. Someone, George she supposed, had left 6 birch logs in the box beside it. Cora stood in the doorway and took in the damage and what remained. She had a 4-season tent, a camp stove, enough food for a week, and nowhere else to be. The regional hospital, where she'd worked as a registered nurse for 9 years, had been quietly absorbed into a larger facility in the latest provincial budget restructuring, and her contract position had been among the first 50 to disappear. She'd received her notice on a Tuesday in August, with 2 days' warning and a form letter. By October, she was renting a room above a laundromat on Elm Street in Sudbury, eating toast for dinner 2 nights a week, and telling herself it was temporary. She pitched the tent inside the intact half of the cabin and lit the stove with George's birch. The wood burned clean and fast. She added a second log and sat beside it until the small room was warm. She slept better that night than she had in 4 months. In the morning, she walked the whole property, starting at the creek at the bottom and working uphill. The land was quiet in the way that northern Ontario bush is quiet in late autumn, a total stillness, no wind, no traffic, only the sound of her boots on frozen ground. The bedrock pushed through the thin soil everywhere, on the upper slope, grey and patient, and indifferent to the spruce trees growing out of its cracks. Cora pressed her palm to an outcrop and thought of her grandfather standing here 40 years ago, doing the same thing. The prospecting shed was at the back of the property, 50 meters uphill from the cabin, or what had once been a shed. The structure had collapsed entirely at some point in the last decade. Weathered boards and corrugated tin, half buried under years of leaf fall and blueberry scrub. At the far edge of the debris, barely visible, was the corner of a concrete pad. She came back with a shovel the following morning. It took 2 days to clear the debris from the pad, working in cold that hovered near -8. The concrete extended back into the hillside further than she'd expected. Not just a foundation, but a formed retaining wall, part of something deliberately built into the slope. Set into the face of the hill, behind where the shed wall had stood, was a steel door in a heavy angle iron frame. The hinges were thick bar stock, engineered to last longer than anyone standing in front of them. The padlock, flush-mounted, the size of her closed fist, was coated in rust and hardened mud. The third key on the estate ring turned it. The tumblers moved more smoothly than they had any right to, as if the mechanism had been maintained within living memory. The door swung outward on hinges that groaned once and then moved freely, and a wave of cold, still, mineral-smelling air came out of the dark. Cora clicked on her headlamp and went in. The room was small, lined in tile meters by formed concrete that had been poured thick and poured well. Against the far wall sat 4 military surplus ammunition cans, the rubber-gasketed kind designed to seal against water and decades. On a wooden shelf that had bowed considerably but not failed, a row of canvas pouches knotted shut. On the concrete floor, weighted flat by 2 smooth river stones that had obviously been carried up from the creek specifically for this purpose, a map tube sealed with a rubber stopper. She opened the nearest ammo can. The contents were wrapped in oilskin, and in a condition that made her breath catch slightly. It was so careful, so deliberate, the kind of preservation that spoke of a person who had been absolutely certain that what they were protecting mattered and would go on mattering. Inside, mining staking certificates from 1971 and 1972, provincial claim registration forms, laboratory assay reports on Timmins Geological Services letterhead, and a stack of letters, her grandfather writing to the Ontario Department of Mines in the careful formal English of someone who'd taught himself to write for official purposes, alongside the ministry's responses. She read the responses twice. They were bureaucratic and evasive, not confused, evasive. There was a specific texture to their non-answers that Cora recognized from years of dealing with hospital administrators. The particular quality of an institution whose representative had been told to make a problem disappear without leaving evidence of the instruction. She set the correspondence aside and opened the map tube. The geological survey had been drafted by hand on drafting linen, the kind of painstaking, large-format cartography that predated computers and required both technical knowledge and the sort of physical patience that George Fielding had apparently possessed in full. It took her several minutes to orient herself to the scale. When she did, she felt the particular quiet of an enormous fact landing without noise. The map was a cross-section of what lay beneath the property, a continuous silver-bearing vein structure running north-northeast through the Precambrian rock, crossing the surveyed boundaries of the parcel at 2 confirmed points. The central lode had been sampled by hand over 3 summers. Sample locations plotted onto the map with numbered references that corresponded to the assay reports in the second can. At the lower margin of the map, in George's handwriting, reported to Ministry of Mines April 14. Told I was mistaken. Vein of no commercial significance. Inspector D.L. Callahan filed competing claim under numbered company 4721 Neen, Ontario Limited on April 28, 1973. Room sealed April 1974. If they cannot steal the record, the claim dies with them. The rock holds what's true. It will still hold when I am gone. Cora sat on the concrete floor and read until the light through the door changed color. She thought about a man who had driven 4 hours north every summer for 50 years to tend a secret he couldn't spend, couldn't tell anyone, couldn't use, who had planted birch trees along the creek bank and fixed the well casing and invited his granddaughter up for 3 weeks at age 6 to teach her to read rock outcrops, who had watched his grandson grow into someone who would have sold the land by lunchtime, who had, in 1987, added a codicil to a mineral rights trust designating a 6-year-old girl as sole beneficiary, and then lived another 36 years without changing it. She photographed every document before she left, all 47 pages. She emailed the photos to herself and to Louise Kaminsky from the ridge above the shed, where she had 4 bars of signal. Then she locked the steel door and went back down the hill to start a fire. Declan Marsh appeared 3 days later. A black pickup conspicuously clean for the state of the road. 2 men in company fleece. The one who climbed the slope toward her moved with the unhurried assurance of someone accustomed to cooperation. Declan was in his mid-50s, silver-haired, with the contained manner of a person who had spent 30 years in resource extraction and regarded most problems as a question of patience and correctly applied pressure. His eyes went to the open steel door, then to the documents in her hand, then back to neutral, but not quickly enough. Mrs. Fielding, he offered a steady, professional smile. You've been busy. This is private property, Mr. Marsh. Of course. He held up both hands. I only wanted to make the offer in person. Given the spring thaw risk on this drainage, it's shaping up to be a high melt year. The province may flag the property for an environmental assessment, which adds time and cost to any disposition. We want to move while things are still straightforward. Another brief glance at the door. Whatever you've found in there, I'd encourage you to speak to a lawyer before drawing any conclusions. Old mining records in this district are notoriously complicated. I have a lawyer. A mining law specialist, ideally. 45,000 was the offer, Cora said. Is that still the figure? A small recalibration moved through his expression. We've revised upward. Given the adjacency value to our current holdings, we could go to 120,000. She looked at him steadily. What changed between last week and this week, Mr. Marsh? The smile Helfer's change. Usually, when someone learns something new, she tucked the map tube under her arm. Get off my land. He was still for a moment. Not threatening, just very present, occupying the space above her on the slope in a way that was clearly intentional. 1 week, he said. After that, our timeline gets more complicated. She watched the truck reverse down the access road and disappear into the spruce. Then she went back inside the sealed room and photographed the documents again, more carefully, and forwarded everything a second time. She was back in the sealed room 4 days later, working through the sample records in the second ammo can by headlamp, when she heard a single set of footsteps on the slope outside, moving quickly, without the sound of a second person. Declan ducked through the steel door before she'd fully turned. He filled the entrance, and in the low beam of her headlamp, his expression had dropped the professional pleasantness entirely. Those documents, he said, are material to a mineral rights proceeding that Northgate has been in active litigation over for 6 years. Removing them from this location constitutes interference with a legal process. Cora kept her voice even. I haven't removed anything, I'm in my own room. I'd like you to place the documents back in the cans and step away from them. He took 1 step into the room. The steel door was behind him. We can work through the formal process with the solicitors. I'll need a few minutes to finish reviewing this section. Mims Fielding. A few minutes, she said again, and turned back as if consulting the open can. Her thumb was already on the phone screen. The email had been prepared since the morning. 47 photographs attached, addressed to Louise Kaminsky, with a second address added at the bottom, the Ontario Securities Commission General Intake Line. She watched the progress bar move across the screen while she held a document up toward the headlamp, appearing to read. Sent. She turned back around. You can have everything in this room if you want it, she said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. I sent copies to my lawyer and to the OSC 40 seconds ago. Time-stamped photographs of everything, including your grandfather's competing claim and the correspondence with Inspector Callahan. She held his gaze without looking away. I've also been recording this conversation since you walked through the door. She had not been recording it. She watched his face. Whatever file Northgate kept on Cora Fielding, contract nurse, rented room above a laundromat, no savings to speak of, brother who would have signed on the first day. It had not prepared Declan Marsh for this particular version of her. She watched him assess the situation and find that it had changed shape entirely. He left without speaking. She listened to his footsteps cross the slope and fade toward the road. Then she sat down on the concrete floor, set her back against the cold wall, and stayed there until her hands stopped shaking. You didn't need to be steady to do the right thing. You only needed to do it. She called Louise. The months that followed were slower and harder than anything that might seem glamorous from the outside. Estate disputes aren't a story. They're a waiting room that doesn't end. Competing mineral rights filings from Northgate. A provincial ministry review that appeared designed more to muddy the water than to resolve anything. A 6-week period in August when Cora's legal fees outpaced her savings, and she had to have a frank conversation with Louise about what she could and couldn't sustain. She was sleeping in the rebuilt half of the cabin by then. She'd fixed the roof herself over June and July with materials from the Cobalt building supply, watching online tutorials on a phone each evening and doing it in the mornings, which was, she told herself, preferable to the Sudbury laundromat room. It was also true. James Okello, the mining law specialist Louise brought in from Sudbury, had a contained professional enthusiasm for legal complexity that Cora found unexpectedly steadying. He went through George Fielding's documents with the focused attention of someone untangling something he genuinely found interesting. "Your grandfather was meticulous," James told her in September. "The 1973 ministry rejection was procedurally improper. Inspector Callahan's competing claim was dissolved when the numbered company wound up in 1989, but the original rejection was never properly adjudicated. Your grandfather didn't formally appeal it. He simply sealed the evidence and waited." James set his reading glasses on the table. "Northgate has known the geological profile of this parcel for years. They've been waiting for a family transfer, expecting someone to sell at a loss. They moved fast after your grandfather died because they were afraid exactly this would happen. That he'd chosen someone who wouldn't. That he'd taken 36 years to choose her," James said. "He registered that mineral rights trust in 1987. You were 6 years old. He had nearly 4 decades to change the beneficiary designation. He never did." In October, Declan sent 2 emails to separate Ontario Ministry of Mines officials, suggesting that a favourable resolution of the competing claims review would be remembered positively when Northgate's next operational licence came up for renewal. One of the officials forwarded both emails to the ministry's ethics office the same afternoon. Northgate's legal team began a quiet retreat within the week. Declan left Northgate Resource Partners by mutual agreement in November. The company faced a ministry audit that stretched well into the following year. The royalty agreement Cora signed in February was not a lottery ticket. The development timeline on a deposit of this nature was measured in years, and significant income was still years away. But the signing bonus, $280,000, landed in her account on a Wednesday morning, and was the most real thing that had happened to her in longer than she wanted to calculate. It cleared the municipal tax arrears. It covered James and Louise in full. It funded the rebuild. By the following spring, the cabin had a new roof across its full length, a new north wall, and a back bedroom that smelled of fresh lumber and linseed oil. The access road had been properly graded for the first time in its history, the drainage culverts set deep. Local contractors from Cobalt and New Liskeard had done the work, people who knew how to build in Precambrian terrain and built things accordingly. The prospecting shed had been rebuilt on its original concrete foundation. The sealed room beneath it was now formally registered with the Ontario Heritage Trust. As George Fielding had quietly requested in the last codicil, he'd added to the trust documents in 2022. He had planned for after. He had always apparently been planning for after. On a Saturday morning in early May, Cora was sitting with coffee on the front step when a car she didn't recognize turned up the new gravel. A domestic sedan, not the Audi. Reed stepped out looking like a version of himself that had been lightly worn. The jacket was still decent, but the set of his face was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the drive north. He looked at the cabin, the road, the rebuilt shed, the cleared hillside where the bedrock showed grey and permanent through the thin soil. He didn't say anything for a moment. "Hello, Reed," she said. "Cora." He walked to the bottom of the porch steps. "Place looks incredible. You actually did it." "I did." He stood with his hands in his pockets in the way she'd watched him do their entire lives. "Listen, I know things got off on the wrong foot at the reading. I was stressed, and I said things I shouldn't have. But we're family, and the way Grandad structured things. Cora, there are resources here that could benefit the whole." "He knew," she said. Reed stopped. He knew exactly what was under this property. He'd known for 50 years. He left it to me because he knew what I'd do with it, and he left you the savings and the truck because he knew what you'd do with that. She held his gaze, not unkindly. He wasn't punishing you. He was being accurate. "That's not. The Mineral Rights Trust has my name on it because he put it there in 1987. I was 6. He brought me up here that summer, and spent 3 weeks teaching me to read rock formations. He didn't put your name on it, Reed. That's not something I did to you." She stood and walked to the edge of the step. A silence stretched between them that had decades of shape to it. "The rock holds what's true," she said at last, George's words worn smooth by a lifetime of repetition, returning to the place they'd been spoken first. It held it when no one was watching. It held it for 50 years. "So do I." She turned and went inside, letting the screen door close behind her on its new spring, firmly, cleanly, the sound of a thing properly hung. She stood at the bay window with her coffee and looked out at the property. The creek at the bottom of the hill was running bright and cold with the last of the snowmelt, its banks scoured down to bare clay where the spring flood had cut through. The birch trees George had planted along the water 30 years ago were already leafed out, the leaves small and translucent in the Maylight, almost luminous. The spring flood had been high again this year. It had taken out a fence section, redirected a drainage channel, exposed bedrock that had been covered since before any of them were born. But the birches had held. Their roots had gone down far enough, anchored into the rock below the soil line, and when the water rose they had bent without breaking, and when it receded they had straightened. The land remembered everything. It had been remembering all along. Now I want to ask you something. If that had been your inheritance, 180 acres of frozen rock, a collapsed roof, and a bill from the municipality, would you have done what Cora did? Would you have slept in a broken cabin, shoveled through 50 years of mud by yourself, and told a man in company fleece to get off your land? Or would you have taken the 120,000 and driven home? Drop your answer in the comments below. We read every single one, and this question is one we keep coming back to. If Cora's story stayed with you, give it a like and pass it on to someone who needs a reminder that what looks like nothing sometimes holds everything. And if you're new here, subscribe to claim the drama. There are more stories like this one, and the next one is already waiting for you.